Well, former City Council Speaker and mayoral hopeful Christine Quinn, she's got an important new gig. She's here to talk to us about her new mission, helping homeless women and children. We'll also talk about how the de Blasio administration is dealing with this hot-button issue. Then Republicans on Capitol Hill grilled the head of Planned Parenthood today as they try to cut off the cash to that women's health group. Could that lead to some unplanned political problems for the GOP? And also, Yankee legend Yogi Berra laid to rest today. We will take you inside as baseball and the world of baseball says a goodbye. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we begin this evening's program with homelessness in New York City. It's a social issue that's also become a political one as well, with growing complaints about the size of the city's homeless population and the increased visibility of these forgotten folks. Now, questions about the behavior of some living on the streets and a whole lot of conflicting ideas about what to do about the problem. Also, whether he or his policies for the number of homeless in New Yorkers, I'm talking about the mayor, is to blame. Now, Mayor de Blasio is getting his fair share of headlines on this subject, and more of that news than not has been negative. But now, one of de Blasio's old rivals, former City Council President Christine Quinn, she's getting personally involved. Starting in November, Quinn will head up a group called Women in Need. It's a nonprofit that helps homeless women and children, and I spoke with her about it earlier today. Well, before we get to some of the solutions and the right approaches to it, let's first assess where we are. How would you characterize the rate of homelessness right now in the city, and go back to even in your times as Speaker in the Council? Has the situation gotten even worse in recent years?
You know, we've seen the numbers over the past couple of years, and certainly in my final term as Speaker, we saw the numbers of homeless people and homeless families tragically increase. I think we're at about 57,000 folks right now in the shelters every night in New York. That's a smidge lower than the all-time high. These are unacceptable numbers. On top of that, you hear a lot from New Yorkers about all of the homeless people they're seeing on the streets. All of this adds up to a situation that I don't think it's overly dramatic to call it a crisis, and one where we really as a society need to get together and commit to helping solve this problem.
You obviously have been following like the rest of us. The mayor's done, if not a 180, certainly he's changed his position. Only a couple months ago, he said that, hey, the numbers aren't going up. This is more of a perception problem than a reality one. Lately, is coming around to a crisis. Why do you think there's been such a disconnect between what people are seeing on the streets and maybe what we're getting out of Gracie Mansion?
Well, you know, I think sometimes the focus is on homeless people that you see on the street. And I understand that as a New Yorker because I see it walking around, right? And it's heartbreaking to see somebody sleeping on the street, particularly if that person is mentally ill or if they're young or if they're old. You don't want to see that. That's not a good place for somebody to be. And I also really understand from a taxpayer's perspective, that's not what you want to see on the streets in a city where you're paying taxes. I get all of that. But I also want to urge New Yorkers to recognize that not seeing the problem, as may have been the case for a number of years, doesn't mean there wasn't a problem. When we had lower complaints of seeing homeless people on the streets, we had really high numbers of people in the shelter. So although I appreciate people should not sleep on the street, they shouldn't block people's doorways, be in children's parks, we can't think not seeing homeless people is the same thing as solving and breaking the cycle of homelessness, which is our goal at WIN, breaking that cycle of homelessness for women and children.
Why are we seeing the problems? And I've heard different theories on this, Chris. Some saying that, hey, this started back from policy changes under the Bloomberg administration. Other people saying that, people aren't policing the streets as much as they are, depending on the perspective. Why are the numbers going up?
I think the reasons you said are absolutely part of the equation. The growing level of jobs may be increasing, but wage is not increasing. The jobs that are increasing being low-wage jobs, that's part of the problems, because we've all seen in our neighborhoods in the city, rents are going up. More and more gentrification in neighborhoods where maybe you used to be able to afford an apartment. That adds to the equation. At WIN, we see the tragedy of domestic violence continuing to play out in society, and that forcing women and their children onto the streets. So, you know, it would be better if there was one thing. You know what I mean? If you could say it was just the Bloomberg policies, or just the police being more lackadaisical, or just income inequality, or just, but it's not. It's all of those things together, and that's why this is an enormous problem that requires government and nonprofits and individuals and faith-based organizations and corporations and philanthropies to come together so we have as many solutions as we have causing factors.
And before we get to the organizational response from a governmental one, Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor, recently put out a piece where he said, hey, the current administration isn't being aggressive enough on this. They're trying to solve the problem with attorneys instead of trying to do it with policing. In fact, he said, quote, you chase them and you chase them and you chase them and you chase them. And you either get them the treatment that they need or you chase them out of the city. Is that a good approach?
The kindness in that piece the former mayor wrote, it just oozed out, and I hope your viewers catch the sarcasm in that statement. Look, I don't think chasing and chasing and chasing people in need is the right way to do it. Think about it. If you were a homeless person, particularly a mentally ill person on the street, and the response from government was to have you chased by police, which really isn't what police officers are trained to do, would you stop and engage with that set of individuals if you were mentally ill? Probably not. Is former Mayor Giuliani right that we need to be firm on the fact that the streets are not okay places for people to sleep? Yes. But chasing and hounding people is not the total answer. And as we are in this week right after Pope Francis left us in New York and in the United States, I don't think at all the way any of us think we should be acting now in New York City, which doesn't mean we go back to the quote-unquote bad days of the critics. Not at all. It means we find resources and we help those folks on the street.
And you know, Chris, recently Dominic did a series on homelessness in the city, and he profiled the same population that your group's going to be dealing with, women and children. And in this case, I know the stereotype is you've got some crackhead who had every opportunity, never bothered to do anything about it, some negligent mother. And the person that he dealt with, young woman from Staten Island who had a couple bad breaks in her life, and her kid were getting shuffled from shelter to shelter, sometimes being moved out at 2 o'clock in the morning, sitting at a bus stop, hoping they get on a bus at 6, not knowing where they go to next. Talk about some of the realities the public may not imagine if you are a woman and a child with no place to go in the city.
It can be that horrific of a story as the one that the case Dominic outlined showed us. You know, we don't see a lot of homeless families on the street, thank God. But I don't want New Yorkers then to forget about homeless women and children. And the reality really is that people can be, if they don't end up getting placed with a top-notch organization like WIN, where we have some of the best shelters that are possible and really try to help people stabilize, bring them holistic services, drug counseling, job training, after-school programs for their children, camps for their children, etc., work with them to move them into permanent housing. Some of it we run, other housing. They can end up getting shuffled around and kind of getting moved around without information, where it's almost as if the way we, move prisoners, quite frankly, where we don't tell them where they're going. That we want to put an end to, because that doesn't help that woman get back to work. It doesn't help her overcome the trauma of domestic violence. It doesn't help her get through the court system or deal with the factors that brought her to homelessness. Because as Dominic's segment and series showed, it's usually not one thing that brings somebody there, and it's not usually exclusively that person's own individual wrongdoing or something like that. The other thing that's really important that we haven't talked enough, in my opinion, about as a society is that child and the trauma that homelessness is for that child. Think of the fear of sitting on that bus at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know your mom is terrified. You know she feels horrible, and neither of you know where you're going. That's a trauma that that child is going to carry with them in a post-traumatic way unless we intervene with appropriate psychological and psychiatric support. And I'm already talking to practitioners in that field about how we can bring those type of resources into the system, because what we don't want is that son or daughter to replicate homelessness when they become an adult.
Former City Council Speaker Christine Quinn heading up a really interesting project coming up this November. Chris, thanks a lot for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
Thank you guys very much, and thank Dominic for his segment and series, please.
You got it. Okay, we will be talking to Dominic in a second. You've heard from Christine Quinn on her efforts to combat homelessness and the differences in how the city handled it under different mayors. Well, what does the panel think? Dom and friends will be with us right after this.